Josephine Parker slammed her hammer down so hard the wooden beam cracked. Then she turned and faced the three men on horseback laughing at her, her chest heaving, sawdust in her hair, blood on her palms, and said with a voice that didn't shake once, "Laugh all you want. This land is mine, and I will be standing on it long after you've forgotten my name." Not one of them answered her. A woman alone, mocked by an entire town, until the richest cowboy in Montana rode past and saw what no one else could see. Subscribe now, watch until the end, and tell us, what city are you watching from? The hammer came down hard, again, and again, and again. Josephine Parker had been swinging it since before the sun cleared the ridge, and she would keep swinging it until her arms gave out, or the darkness came, whichever arrived first. She didn't stop for the cold. She didn't stop for the blisters that had opened across her palms 2 days ago and were now raw and stinging with every grip. She didn't stop for the sound of horses on the road above her property line, or the voices that drifted down whenever riders slowed to look. She especially didn't stop for the laughter. It was November in Montana Territory 1887, and the ground was stubborn, and the wind had a mean streak, and Josephine Parker was 34 years old alone and building a cabin with her own 2 hands on a piece of land that had cost her every cent she had left in the world. The beam she was wrestling with now was heavier than she'd expected. She had miscalculated the weight when she'd sketched her plans by candlelight 3 weeks ago in the boarding house in Larkspur Creek, sitting on a cot with her knees pulled to her chest and a stub of pencil in her hand. The pencil had been borrowed. The plans had come entirely from memory, from years of watching her father build, from years of listening, from years of telling herself she would remember this and this and this, just in case. Just in case had arrived. She braced the beam against her hip, shifted her feet in the dirt, and pushed. The wood groaned. Her shoulders screamed. She pushed harder. "You're going to hurt yourself." The voice came from the road. She didn't look up. "I've been hurting myself for 34 years, she said. "I'm used to it." There was a pause. Then the sound of a horse moving on. She didn't watch it go. She got the beam into position. The town of Larkspur Creek was the kind of place that had opinions about everything and evidence for none of them. It sat at the edge of a wide river valley about 6 miles from Josephine's land, and it had a general store, 2 saloons, a church that was also used for town meetings, a schoolhouse, a livery, a telegraph office, and approximately 300 people who all seemed to know each other's business better than their own. Josephine had arrived in Larkspur Creek in late September, stepping off a mud-spattered stagecoach with a single trunk, a leather satchel, and the kind of face that told people she wasn't there to make friends. She'd gone straight to the land registry office, paid for her parcel. 40 acres of timber and slope and creek-fed meadow legally filed under her name, and then walked to the boarding house and asked for the cheapest room they had. "How long will you be staying?" the woman at the desk had asked. Her name was Cora Beach, and she had small eyes that moved fast. "Until my cabin is done," Josephine had said. Cora Beach had looked at her the way you look at someone who has just said something foolish and doesn't know it yet. "You're building a cabin." "That's right." "Yourself." "That's right." The small eyes had moved even faster. "Where's your husband?" "I don't have one." "Your father brothers?" "Not available." There had been a silence in which Josephine understood that she had just become a story. She could feel it happening, the way the information rearranged itself behind Cora Beach's eyes into something that would be repeated over dinner, over coffee, over the back fence. A woman, alone, 40 acres, building a cabin herself. "Can you imagine rooms $1 a week?" Cora had said finally. "I'll take it for 6 weeks," Josephine had said. Maybe 8. She had been wrong about the timeline. The land had more rock than she'd expected. The timber she needed for the framing was farther up the slope than her initial survey had suggested. And the work, the actual physical grueling work of clearing and leveling and hauling and cutting, was slower alone than her calculations had accounted for. She had adjusted. She had always adjusted. By the first week of October, the story of the woman building a cabin alone had spread through Larkspur Creek, the way wildfire spreads through dry grass, fast hungry, and leaving a changed landscape behind it. She heard pieces of it when she came into town for supplies. She didn't go often. Every trip was calculated what she needed, how much it would cost, how long it would take, because every hour in town was an hour not working. But she needed nails, and she needed rope, and she needed cornmeal, and the general store was the only place to get them. The general store was run by a man named Walt Greer, who was decent enough, but who talked too much. The first time Josephine came in for supplies, he helped her fill her order, and then said as he was tying the rope into a bundle, "You know there are men in this town who do construction work. Good men. Fair prices." "I'm sure there are," Josephine said. "Might go faster, with help." "I work better alone." Walt Greer had tied off the rope and looked at her the way Cora Beach had looked at her, with that same mixture of pity and disbelief that Josephine was already learning to recognize and file away as irrelevant. "It's going to be a hard winter," he said. "Coming early, they say." "Then I'd better hurry." She paid for her supplies, loaded them into the small cart she'd hired from the livery, and drove back out to her land. Behind her, she could feel the conversation starting. She didn't need to hear it. She already knew every word. The first mini-crisis came in the second week of October, when the wall frame she'd been building over 4 days shifted in the night and came apart at the north corner joint. She found it at dawn, stood looking at it for a long moment. Then she went and got her tools and started over. She was re-driving the corner pins when she heard footsteps in the brush above her. She looked up to find a boy of about 12, standing at the edge of her cleared land, watching her with open curiosity. He had red hair and a gap in his front teeth, and he was carrying a fishing pole. "Are you the lady building the cabin?" he asked. "I am." "Mama says you're making a mistake." Josephine considered this. "Your mama might be right. Hand me that mallet, would you?" The boy looked at the mallet on the ground near his feet. Then he picked it up and brought it to her. "My name's Tommy Briggs. My pa's a carpenter." "Is he good?" "Mama says he's the best in the territory." "Then he's wasted in Larkspur Creek," Josephine said. She drove the pin home with 3 clean strokes. "Thank you for the mallet, Tommy." He didn't leave. He stood watching her work for another 10 minutes, with the kind of focused attention that children give to things that confuse and interest them in equal measure. Then he said, "Why are you doing it yourself?" She paused and looked at him. He was a straight-backed, serious-faced child who seemed to actually want an answer, not just something to report back. "Because it's mine. And I want to know every inch of it. I want to know where every nail went in. I want to know every seam and every joint and every board. Because when the wind comes and the snow comes and the cold comes, I want to know that this place held because I built it right, not because I hired someone to build it for me." Tommy Briggs chewed on that for a moment. "My pa says a woman can't." "Your pa hasn't met me," Josephine said pleasantly. Tommy grinned, showing the gap in his teeth. Then he picked up his fishing pole and walked away toward the creek. She didn't think about him again until 2 days later, when she was hauling a load of timber up from the lower slope, and she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Tommy Briggs again, this time with a slightly older boy, and both of them had their shirt sleeves rolled up. "We came to help," Tommy announced. Josephine straightened, looked at them both. "Did your parents send you?" "No, ma'am." "Did they say you could come?" A pause. "Not exactly. She should have sent them home. She knew it. But the timber was heavy, and her shoulder was aching from the joint that had shifted 3 weeks ago and never quite settled right again. And there were 2 sets of young, strong arms standing in front of her, looking ready and willing. "If you help me haul this load up the slope, I'll give you each a piece of cornbread, and then you'll go straight home and tell your mothers where you were." Tommy looked at the other boy. The other boy looked at Tommy. Then they both grabbed an end of the timber. They hauled it up together. She gave them the cornbread. They told her their names, Tommy Briggs and Pete Alderman, and they disappeared back toward town, with the slightly guilty, slightly triumphant look of boys who have done something they're not sure about yet. The timber was up the slope. That was what mattered. The laughter started in earnest the 3rd week of October. It wasn't malicious exactly. Or maybe it was Josephine was never entirely sure where carelessness ended and cruelty began. But a group of men began making a habit of riding past her property on Sunday afternoons when they had time on their hands and liquor from Saturday still warm in their blood, and they would slow their horses and watch her work and make comments to each other at a volume calibrated to be heard. How long do you give her? Before what? Before she quits, or before the whole thing falls on her head? Laughter. I give her 2 more weeks, 3 if she's as stubborn as she looks. Bill Travers says she'll be gone by Christmas. Bill Travers is an optimist. More laughter. Josephine kept working. She had long ago learned that the most devastating response to ridicule was ignoring it, not with visible effort, not with the tight-jawed, white-knuckled, ignoring that told everyone it was getting to you, but with the loose, easy, genuinely indifferent kind that came from actually not caring what people thought. She had spent a long time learning not to care. The lessons had been expensive. One Sunday, when 3 riders had been sitting on the road above her property for nearly 20 minutes with their commentary and their laughter, a 4th horse appeared from the east on the ridge road. It was a big animal, dark as coffee, and the man on it rode the way men rode when they'd been in the saddle since they were children, balanced and easy, and with no wasted motion. He didn't slow down when he reached the others. He stopped. She was aware of him, the way she was aware of all of them, peripherally, without looking filed under irrelevant. She kept her hands on her work. "Afternoon, Henry," one of the riders said. "Afternoon." His voice was even. Not warm, not cold. The voice of a man deciding something. "Come to watch the show." A pause. "What show is that?" "Lady over there's building herself a cabin. All by herself. Been at it 3 weeks." Another pause, longer this time. "How's it coming?" the voice said. She almost looked up. She caught herself and didn't. But something in the question snagged at her attention, because it was the first time anyone on that road had asked about the quality of the work, rather than the spectacle of the worker. "How's it coming?" one of the other men repeated, as though he hadn't understood the question. "The cabin," the even voice said. "The framing. How's it looking?" Silence. I haven't looked that close." "I have," the even voice said. And then the dark horse moved on down the road, and the sound of hoofbeats faded, and the group of riders on the ridge were quiet for a moment before they found their way back to their laughter. But it was different after that. A little flatter. A little less sure of itself. Josephine drove a nail home and said nothing. His name was Henry Sullivan, and by the time Josephine Parker had been working her land for a month, she knew 3 things about him, the way you know things about a man in a small town without ever meeting him directly: that he was wealthy, that he was respected, and that he was private in a way that people in Larkspur Creek had given up trying to crack. The Sullivan Ranch was the largest operation in the valley. 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, cattle numbered in the hundreds, a main house that had been built with actual architectural plans, and imported glass windows. Henry Sullivan had inherited it from his father at 22 and had spent the 12 years since expanding it quietly and efficiently, without drama and without enemies, which in Montana territory was something close to a superpower. Howe was also, by general agreement, unmarried in a way that had long since stopped being interesting and had become simply a fact, like the weather or the river. Women had tried. Mothers of women had tried. He was polite to all of them. Nothing had ever come of any of it. What Josephine knew, and what the town didn't know she knew, was that Henry Sullivan had ridden past her property every 3 or 4 days since that Sunday on the Ridge Road. She had clocked it without meaning to. Her mind kept inventory the way it had always kept inventory, tallying details against possible relevance. The dark horse. The particular hour, always mid-morning or late afternoon, always moving at an easy pace, never stopping, never calling out. He didn't watch her the way the others watched her. He looked the way you look at something that interests you, and then he rode on. She found it neither flattering nor threatening. She found it interesting. She was interested in very little these days, so she noted it and went back to work. The encounter that changed everything happened on a Tuesday in early November, when the temperature had dropped hard overnight, and the ground was iron stiff, and her breath made clouds in the air as she worked. She was up on the partial wall frame, not high, only 6 feet, but enough that a fall would cost her something. Wrestling a crossbeam into alignment when the joint slipped and the beam swung, and she grabbed the nearest vertical post to keep from going over the edge. She caught herself. She always caught herself. But in the catching, she wrenched her left wrist hard, and for a moment, she just held on to the post with her good hand, and breathed, and waited for the white heat to settle into something manageable. It settled. She tested the wrist. It moved reluctantly, which meant it wasn't broken, which was the only thing that mattered. She was climbing carefully back down when she heard the hoofbeats. She knew the particular rhythm of that horse. By now, she would have known it in her sleep, and she paused on the frame with her feet on the lowest beam and watched Henry Sullivan bring his horse to a stop 20 feet from her property line. He sat looking at her wrist, then at her face, then at the beam she'd been trying to place. "That's a two-person lift. I noticed. You hurt your wrist. It'll be fine." Howe was quiet for a moment. She could see him working something out behind his eyes, not calculating exactly, but deliberating the way a careful man deliberates before he says something he won't be able to take back. "I could hold the other end," he said finally. She looked at him for a long moment. He sat very still on the dark horse, and his face was the face of a man who was making an offer and was prepared to hear no. Why? The question surprised him. She could see it in the small shift around his eyes. "Because you can't lift it alone. People can't lift a lot of things alone. That doesn't usually make rich men on horseback stop and offer to help." He held her gaze steadily. "No, it doesn't. So why are you—" Another pause. "Longer. Because you've been at this for a month. And I've been riding past this property for a month. And I've watched you reframe that north wall 3 times. And every time it went wrong, you just started over. You didn't quit. You didn't ask anyone for anything. You just started over." He paused. "I know what that costs." The last sentence landed differently than the rest. It didn't have the shape of small talk or flattery. It had the shape of something true. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "The beam is up there." He tied his horse to a nearby tree and climbed up after her, and they repositioned the crossbeam together, and she directed the angle, and he held the weight while she drove the pins. And they didn't talk much because the work required concentration, and because neither of them was the kind of person who talked to fill silence. When the beam was set, and she'd checked every joint twice, she climbed down, and he climbed down after her, and they stood on the ground and looked up at the frame in the gray morning light. "It's good work. The frame is square. I measured 6 times. How'd you learn?" "My father. I helped him build everything on our property from the time I could hold a nail." She looked at the frame. "He taught me that if you build the bones right, everything else can be fixed. But if the bones are wrong, nothing you do after will save it." He was quiet looking at the frame. Then he said, "Where's your father now?" "Dead. 3 years ago." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." She turned and picked up her hammer, and the conversation was closed. She heard him untying his horse. "Henry Sullivan," he said from behind her. She turned. He had his hand out. She looked at it for a moment. "I know who you are." "I figured." He kept his hand out. She shook it. "Josephine Parker." "I know who you are," he said, and there was something dry in it, something that might have been almost a smile. She released his hand. "Well, thank you for the beam." "Any time." He mounted his horse and rode back toward the ridge road. She watched him go for exactly as long as it took her to understand that she was watching him go, and then she looked away and picked up her work where she'd left it. The second twist in the growing story of Josephine Parker came the following Friday, and it came in the form of a man named Clarence Marsh. Clarence Marsh was 61 years old, thick through the chest and arms, from decades of hard work he hadn't done personally in at least 20 years. He owned the Marsh Land and Cattle Company, which was the second largest operation in the valley, and he had come to that ownership through a combination of inheritance, strategic marriage, and the particular talent some men have for acquiring things that technically belong to other people. He arrived at Josephine's property in a buggy, which was how she knew it was going to be a formal visit. Men who came to intimidate you in the territory came on horseback, where they had height advantage and a quick exit. Men who came to make business proposals came in buggies, which said, "I am here to negotiate," which also said, "I believe there is something to negotiate." There wasn't. She knew that before he opened his mouth. She had been told about Clarence Marsh in the first week she'd arrived in Larkspur Creek by Walt Greer in the general store, who had a loose tongue and a good memory, and who had given her the essential geography of power in the valley without apparently realizing he was doing so. She knew that Marsh had been eyeing the creek-fed meadow section of her 40 acres since before she bought it had in fact been told by the previous owner that there might be a buyer for the land, a buyer who hadn't materialized because the land had been sold through a different office than Marsh's man had been watching. "Miss Parker," Marsh said, stepping down from the buggy with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees gave him trouble he wouldn't admit to. "I've been meaning to come out and introduce myself." "Mr. Marsh." She didn't put down her tools. He looked around at the work she'd done. She watched him process it, the cleared land, the stacked lumber, the frame rising at the center of the property. He processed it the way men like him processed things that didn't fit their assumptions by finding a way to minimize them. "I see you've made a start," he said pleasantly. "I've made a good deal more than a start." A small smile. "Of course. Of course." He clasped his hands behind his back and walked a few steps, looking at the ground, the posture of a man about to say something reasonable. "I'll come to the point, Miss Parker. I know why you bought this land, and I understand, I truly do, why a woman in your situation might think this was a viable option." "My situation," she repeated. "Alone, starting over, looking for independence. It's admirable, really. But the truth is, this piece of ground has some significant challenges. The drainage is poor on the north slope. The timber stand isn't as dense as it looks from a distance. You'd strip it in 10 years, maybe less. And the creek access well." Another pleasant smile. "I've been doing some research, and I think you'll find that the property lines around the creek section may not be as clear as the registry made them appear." She looked at him. She kept her face very still and her voice very even, and she said, "What are you suggesting, Mr. Marsh?" "I'm suggesting that before you put any more work into this project, you might want to consider an alternative. I'd be willing to take the land off your hands at a fair price. Enough for you to get yourself settled somewhere more appropriate, maybe closer to town. A boarding house, perhaps, or—" "The property lines are clear," Josephine said. "I reviewed the registry documents myself, and I had a surveyor confirm them before I broke ground. Every acre I own is documented, filed, and witnessed." The pleasant smile stayed on Marsh's face, but something behind it changed. "Surveyors make mistakes. Mine didn't. Property records can be, Mr. Marsh." Her voice was still even, still quiet, but something in it made him stop. "I know exactly what you're doing. I know exactly what you want. And I'm telling you now, as clearly as I know how to say it, this land is mine. I bought it legally. I built on it legally. And I will live on it legally for as many years as I choose. You can contest the property lines if you'd like. You'll lose. And you'll have wasted time and money and your own attorney's patience for absolutely nothing." She held his gaze. "Now, is there anything else?" Clarence Marsh looked at her for a long moment. The pleasant smile was gone. What was underneath it wasn't quite anger. It was something colder and more calculating, the expression of a man revising his strategy rather than abandoning it. "You're a stubborn woman, Miss Parker. That's the kindest thing I've been called this month." He turned and got back into his buggy with the same careful deliberateness, and he drove back toward the ridge road without looking back. Josephine watched him go. Then she turned and picked up her hammer and drove a nail home with 3 hard, precise strokes. But her mind was moving faster than her hands, and it had already started mapping the shape of what was coming. She was in Walt Greer's store the next morning when she overheard the conversation. She had come in for kerosene and hadn't announced herself, and Walt was in the back of the store, and 2 men she didn't know were at the counter, and they were talking with the comfortable ease of people who believe themselves unobserved. "Marsh is filing a complaint with the land office," one of them said. "Says there's an error in the Parker woman's registry. Claims his company had prior interest in the creek section." "Prior interest?" The other man's voice was skeptical. "That mean anything legal?" Means whatever Marsh wants it to mean. He's got Judge Howell. A pause. Howell rules in his favor. When doesn't he rule in Marsh's favor? Low laughter. Josephine stood very still in the back aisle with kerosene in her hands and let the information arrange itself in her mind. Then she set the kerosene on the shelf, walked to the front counter, said good morning to the two startled men, and asked Walt Greer to add a candle and 2 yards of writing paper to her order. She had letters to write. The letter that mattered most went to a man named Robert Fitch in Helena, who was the Territorial Land Commissioner's chief clerk and who had processed Josephine's purchase himself. She had met him once at the registry office, and she had paid attention to the particulars of the transaction in a way that she understood now with a kind of dull, tired gratitude had been unconsciously protective. She wrote him a careful, precise letter. She described the transaction. She cited the file numbers. She asked him to confirm in writing that the registry was clear and that no prior claims existed on any portion of her 40 acres. She wrote without urgency and without alarm, because urgency and alarm were for people who didn't know the exact contents of the documents they had filed. She knew the exact contents. She sent the letter on Monday. By Wednesday, 2 things had happened. The first was that she found a dead rabbit on her property line. It was placed deliberately. She could see that from how it was positioned, perfectly centered between 2 of her survey stakes. It was the kind of message that was designed to unsettle someone who could be unsettled by ambiguous threats. She picked it up, carried it to the tree line, and left it there. Something would make use of it. The second thing that happened was that Henry Sullivan appeared at her property line on Wednesday morning while she was working on the window framing, and this time he didn't stay on the road. He tied his horse to the same tree as before and walked down to where she was working, and he had a look on his face that said he knew something and was deciding whether to say it. She let him decide. Marsh is moving on your land claim. I know. I heard about the complaint. He blinked, just slightly the smallest possible tell of surprise. When? Monday morning. Walt Greer's store. She set her measuring square against the window frame and checked the angle. True. Thank you for coming to tell me. He was quiet for a moment. Are you worried? No. Marsh has Judge Howell, and Howell has history. I know, but Marsh also has a problem, which is that my claim is clean. I reviewed every document myself before I filed. The registry is clear. I have survey confirmation. And I've written to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office for written confirmation, which I expect within the week. She looked at him. He's hoping I'll be frightened into selling before the confirmation comes back. Henry Sullivan looked at her for a long moment. You planned for this, it wasn't a question. I planned for the possibility of this. When you've had your property stolen from you, once you learn to file everything very, very carefully the next time. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She was grateful for that, because she couldn't have borne pity from him. Something more like recognition. What did you lose? He asked quietly. She kept her hands on the window frame and her eyes on the work. My family's farm. In Missouri, after my father died. There was a man not unlike Marsh, actually. He produced documents claiming my father had borrowed against the property. The documents weren't real, but the judge believed him, or chose to. She paused. I had a lawyer. I fought it for 8 months. And at the end of 8 months, I had no farm, no money, and no more faith in the idea that the law protects people who deserve protecting. The words came out flat and plain, stripped of anything that might have looked like wanting sympathy. That was the only way she could say them. So you came to Montana. So I came to Montana, where I could buy land outright, record it properly, and build something that nobody could take from me. She checked the window angle again. Still true. I was not going to let the same thing happen twice. I was very quiet. She could feel him thinking beside her the particular quality of silence that meant active thought rather than absence. Marsh has more power in this valley than the law accounts for, he said finally. He has favors owed and levers he's not ashamed to use. The land commissioner's letter will help, but it may not be enough if Howell decides to. Then I'll go above Howell. I'll go to the territorial court if I have to. I'll go to the federal land office. I'll write to every relevant office between here and Washington, D.C., if that's what it takes. She looked at him directly. I am not going to lose this land, Mr. Sullivan. I want to be very clear about that. I am not going to lose it. Henry Sullivan held her gaze. And something in his face, in the particular arrangement of his expression, settled into something she hadn't seen there before. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was something more specific than admiration. It was the look of a man who had just met someone who reminded him of himself in a way he hadn't been reminded in a very long time. No, I don't think you are. He helped her set 3 more window frames that afternoon, and he left before the light changed, and Josephine worked until she could no longer see her hands. The confirmation letter from Helena arrived on Friday. The cabin's bones were straight and true, and everything the bones needed to hold was still ahead of her, but the bones were right. If the bones were right, everything else could be fixed. Her father had told her that. She was beginning to believe he had been right about more than carpentry. Her father had told her that, and standing in the last light of a Friday afternoon in Montana Territory, with a letter from Helena in her hand and sawdust in her hair. Josephine Parker was beginning to believe he had been right about more than carpentry. The letter was exactly what she'd asked for. Robert Fitch, chief clerk to the Territorial Land Commissioner, had written in precise official language that the registry of record for the Parker parcel, 40 Acres Creek section, included filed under the name Josephine Ann Parker on the 28th day of September 1887 was clear, uncontested, and without prior encumbrance of any kind. He had attached a certified copy of the original filing. He had signed it twice, once as clerk and once as witness to his own certification. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope inside the leather satchel she kept under her cot at the boarding house. Then she went back out to her land and worked until dark. She didn't tell anyone about the letter, not yet. She had learned expensively in Missouri, over 8 months, that cost her everything, that the moment you showed your strongest card was not the moment you received it. You waited. You waited until the other person had committed themselves so completely to a course of action that reversing it would cost them more than losing. Clarence Marsh hadn't committed himself yet. He was still in the stage of applying pressure, testing her nerves, seeing if she would fold before he had to spend anything real. The dead rabbit. The whispered conversations in the general store designed to reach her ears. The complaint filed at the land office, which she'd confirmed through Walt Greer's loose tongue, was currently sitting unsigned on Judge Howell's desk, waiting for the judge to decide whether he wanted his name on it. Marsh was waiting to see if she would run. She would not run, but she would let him keep thinking she might. For a little while longer. The Saturday after the letter arrived, Josephine came into town for supplies and found that the story had grown a new chapter. She could feel it before anyone said anything, in the way conversations near her shifted, in the particular quality of the glances that followed her down the main street. Something had changed in the air around her name. She found out what it was when Cora Beach met her at the boarding house door that evening, with the barely contained energy of someone who had been saving information all day. Clarence Marsh has been telling people, Cora said, that your property filing has an irregularity, that you may have misrepresented your legal standing when you purchased the land. Josephine set her supply bags down. He's been telling people that, has he? At the Elkhorn Saloon, loudly. 3 men heard him and told their wives, and Cora paused, then said what she actually meant. People are wondering if maybe you should have taken his offer when he came out to see you. What offer? Josephine kept her voice mild. He told people he offered you a fair price, a generous price, and that you turned him down out of pride. Josephine looked at Cora Beach for a moment. Cora was not a bad woman. She was a woman who lived on information, the way some people lived on bread. It was her sustenance, her currency, the thing that made her feel she understood the world. The problem with people like that was, they didn't always check whose interests the information served before they passed it along. Cora, Josephine said, if a man offers to buy your house for a generous price, and you decline because the house is your home and you have no intention of leaving it, is that pride? Cora opened her mouth and closed it. Or is it just ownership? Josephine picked up her bags. I'll be in for breakfast at the usual time. She went upstairs. She sat on her cot in the dark for a while, and let herself feel very briefly the particular exhaustion that came not from physical labor, but from being required at all times to be 3 steps ahead of people who wanted to see you fail. Then she got out her writing paper and wrote 2 more letters. She had been wrong about one thing. She'd thought Marsh would wait longer before escalating. She'd given him another 2 weeks at least, time to test the temperature of the room, time to see whether his campaign of whispered doubt was doing its work. She had underestimated his impatience. On Monday morning, she arrived at her land to find that someone had pulled up 6 of her survey stakes on the eastern boundary. Not all of them, just the 6 that delineated the corner of the creek section, the section Marsh wanted. She stood looking at the holes in the ground for a long moment. 6 stakes, pulled cleanly, no damage to the surrounding ground, which meant it had been done carefully and deliberately, not in haste. Someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who wanted to create a question, not destroy evidence, but introduce ambiguity. Where exactly was the eastern boundary? Who could say now that the markers were gone? She could say. She had the original survey map signed and witnessed with measurements from fixed landmarks. The stakes could be replaced by anyone with a compass and the survey document. The damage was more symbolic than practical. But it told her something important. Marsh was no longer testing. He had made a choice. She reset the stakes herself, using her survey map and a compass she'd owned for 15 years. It took her 4 hours. Her back ached from bending and kneeling in the cold ground, and her replaced wrist throbbed dully, and she worked with the steady mechanical precision of someone who has decided that anger is only useful when it's harnessed. She was harnessing it very carefully. When Henry Sullivan's dark horse appeared on the ridge road at mid-morning, she was driving the last stake home. He came down from the road without asking this time. He stood at the edge of her cleared land and looked at the fresh-turned earth around the new stakes. And he didn't say anything for a moment, and she appreciated that he didn't. The eastern boundary. Yes. When? Sometime over the weekend. I found them this morning. He looked at the stakes, at the survey map rolled and tucked under her arm, at the compass in her hand. You reset them yourself. I have the survey document. Josephine. He said her name the way you say something you've been thinking for a while. This isn't going to stop with the stakes. I know that. Marsh has 3 men on his payroll who aren't cowboys. They're the kind of men who do whatever needs doing without asking what it is. He used them on the Dietrich family 2 years ago. The Dietrichs had a water rights dispute with Marsh, and within a month their barn burned down. She went very still. Did anyone prove anything? No. Marsh is careful. He paused. I'm not telling you this to scare you. What are you telling me then? I'm telling you that you need to not be alone out here. You need witnesses. You need people who can say what they saw when they saw it. Because if Marsh decides to move from pressure to damage, a survey document won't protect you. Josephine looked at him. There was something about the way he was standing, hat in his hands, not on his head, which she'd noticed was a thing he did when he was serious about something, that told her this conversation had cost him something to start. Why does it matter to you? She asked. The question stopped him. Not because he didn't have an answer, she thought, but because the honest answer was one he wasn't sure he wanted to give. Because I watched the Dietrichs leave, he said finally. They loaded everything they had left into a wagon and drove away from land their family had worked for 11 years. And I didn't. He stopped. I knew what Marsh was. I knew what he was capable of. And I didn't do anything because it wasn't my fight, and I told myself that was good enough. He looked at her steadily. It wasn't. The honesty in it was uncomfortable in the way that real honesty is always slightly uncomfortable because it has weight, and weight requires a response. I'm not the Dietrichs, Josephine said. No, you're not. And I'm not going to leave. I know that. So what are you proposing? He put his hat back on. My ranch hand Miguel rides this stretch of road every morning and evening. He's been doing it for 6 years and he knows every inch of this valley. I'd like him to add your property to his route, close enough to see, not so close as to intrude. He paused. And I'd like you to have this. He reached into his coat and produced a small brass-fitted whistle on a cord. She looked at it. It carries about 1/4 mile in open air. Miguel will hear it. She looked at the whistle for a moment. Then she looked at him. I've been taking care of myself for 3 years, Mr. Sullivan. I know you have. I know you don't need it. I'm asking if you'll take it anyway, because I'd rather have given you something you didn't need than not have given you something you did. The silence between them was a particular kind, not uncomfortable, but alive. The kind of silence that happens when two people are being more honest than they intended. She took the whistle. She put it around her neck without ceremony and tucked it under her collar. Thank you. He nodded once, and then he said quietly, What happened to you, in Missouri? Do you mind if I ask? She picked up her tools. The short version or the long version? Whichever one you want to tell. She was quiet for a moment, deciding. Short version. My father died and left the farm to me. A man named Gerald Holt appeared within 3 weeks claiming my father had borrowed money against the property and hadn't repaid it. He had documents. The documents were forged. I knew it, my lawyer knew it, but the judge had debts of his own, and Holt had been patient enough to accumulate them. She adjusted the survey map under her arm. I lost the farm. I lost 8 months and everything I had to the lawsuit. And then I picked myself up, and I came here because Montana Territory was the farthest place I could get to where land was still affordable, and I could file my own name on the deed without anyone's permission. Henry Sullivan was quiet for a moment. How old were you? 31 when my father died. 32 when I lost the farm. He nodded slowly. Something in his face was very careful. I'm sorry. Not the polite kind of sorry. The kind that means I actually understand what that cost you. She looked at him. How would you understand what that cost me? He held her gaze. Because I've had things taken from me too. Not land, but things that mattered. He didn't offer more than that, and she didn't ask for more because she recognized the particular shape of something a person has said as much of as they intend to say today. Well, we'd better both get back to work. He almost smiled. Not quite. Yes, ma'am, and walked back to his horse. She watched him go. This time she didn't catch herself watching. She just let it be what it was. Jag. The town meeting happened on the 3rd Thursday of November, and Josephine was not invited. She found out about it from Tommy Briggs, who had taken to appearing at her property on his way home from school 2 or 3 times a week, ostensibly to fish in the creek, but actually she suspected to watch her work and ask her questions he couldn't ask at home. He was sharp and curious, and almost entirely without the condescension that the adults around him deployed so naturally, and she had come to look forward to his visits in the uncomplicated way you look forward to things that are genuinely pleasant. He arrived on Thursday afternoon with his fishing pole and a look on his face that said he had something to say. There was a meeting. In the church, last night. She kept her hands on the dovetail joint she was fitting. What kind of meeting? Mr. Marsh was there, and Judge Howell, and a lot of the men from town. Tommy was quiet for a moment. My pa was there. He came home and told Mama that there was going to be a hearing about your land. Her hands paused, just for a beat. Then she resumed. What kind of hearing? I don't know exactly, but Pa said Mr. Marsh had papers showing your property filing had an error, and that the creek section was never legally yours to file on. He hesitated. Pa said he thinks you might have to leave. Josephine set down her chisel. She looked at Tommy Briggs with his gap-toothed, serious 12-year-old face, and she said, Tommy, does your father know you're telling me this? Tommy looked at the ground. No, ma'am. Why did you come to tell me? A long pause. Because it didn't seem fair that everyone got to hear about it except you. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, That's a good reason. Thank you. He nodded, still looking at the ground. Are you going to have to leave? No. She said it the way she'd said everything true and important in the last 2 months, plainly, without decoration, with the full weight of what she meant. I am not going to have to leave. He looked up at her. How do you know? Because I filed correctly, because I have documentation, because the truth is on my side. She picked her chisel back up. And because I have never once lost a fight that the truth was on my side for. Tommy considered this with the gravity of a child absorbing something he'll remember for the rest of his life. Then he picked up his fishing pole and went to the creek. She went to see Henry Sullivan that evening. She had not been to the Sullivan Ranch before. She had only known its direction east on the ridge road through the pines, down into the wider part of the valley, where the grass was better. She rode the livery horse she'd been renting by the hour when she needed to cover distance, and she arrived at the ranch gate as the last of the light was going orange and thin above the mountains. A young Mexican man, Miguel, she assumed the road rider, was near the gate when she came in. He looked at her with quiet attention, took in the horse and the set of her jaw and whatever else he needed to know, and said, "I'll let him know you're here." Henry Sullivan came out of the main house and crossed the yard toward her with the unhurried pace of a man who doesn't run for anything. And when he reached her, he looked up at her on the horse and said simply, "What happened?" "There's going to be a hearing," she said. "A property hearing. Marsh has been meeting with Howell and apparently enough of the town to make it look like a community concern rather than a personal land grab." She swung down from the horse. "He's been telling people my filing has an error. The error doesn't exist. I have written confirmation from the land commissioner's office. But Howell is the local judge, and the hearing will be local. And if Marsh controls enough of what Howell hears, he'll rule in Marsh's favor regardless of the documentation," Henry said. "That's what I'm worried about." He was quiet for a moment. "Come inside. I need to show you something." The inside of the Sullivan house was nothing like what she'd expected, which was foolish. She'd had no business expecting anything. It was spare and functional, and not particularly comfortable. The house of a man who spent almost no time thinking about the inside of his own house. There were good maps on the wall. There were books more than she'd expected stacked on and around a heavy desk near the window. There was a fireplace, a table, 4 chairs, and a sense of order that came from habit rather than care. Henry went to the desk and opened a drawer and took out a document. He brought it to the table and spread it out. It was a land registry map, official surveyed, stamped with the territorial seal. She leaned over it and found her parcel immediately outlined in pencil. Henry's finger moved to a section south of hers. "This is the Dietrich land." Or it was. After they left, Marsh filed a purchase claim at a price significantly below market. The filing went through Howell's office. His finger moved. "This is the Werner parcel. Family gave up their water rights dispute in the summer of '85. Marsh acquired the water access within 6 weeks of them dropping the suit." His finger moved again. 3 other parcels in the last 8 years, all acquired through variations of the same approach. Pressure, doubt, a compliant judge, and people who had no one willing to stand up beside them. Josephine studied the map. The pattern was visible once you knew to look for it, and it made her stomach tighten in a cold, specific way. "He's been doing this for years. 8 years that I can document," Henry said. "Probably longer." She looked up at him. "And no one's challenged him." He held her gaze. "No one's been willing to pay what challenging him costs." "What does it cost?" "Reputation, business relationships. Marsh controls enough supply contracts and grazing rights in this valley that going against him publicly means a lot of people quietly make your life harder." He paused. "I have enough insulation from that. I've never had a reason strong enough to matter more than the peace of staying out of it." She understood what he was saying. She looked at him steadily. "And now?" "Now," he said, "I think I do." The fire crackled. Outside, Miguel was moving around the yard, and the horses were quiet in the barn, and the particular stillness of a ranch after dark was settling over everything. "What are you thinking?" Josephine asked. "I'm thinking," Henry said, "that if you walk into that hearing alone with your land commissioner letter, Howell will find a procedural reason to delay. Marsh will use the delay to manufacture more doubt, and the thing will drag on long enough that it becomes easier for you to sell than to keep fighting." He looked at the map. "But if you don't walk in alone?" "If I don't walk in alone, it changes the calculation." "For Howell, yes. Howell is corrupt, but he's not stupid. He knows how far Marsh's protection extends and where it stops. If someone is standing beside you who is outside that protection, someone whose business Marsh can't touch, whose relationships he can't leverage, he'll have to actually rule on the evidence. Or recuse himself and bring in someone from outside the valley," Henry said. which Marsh won't want because an outside judge doesn't owe him anything. She looked at the map for a moment. Then she looked at him. You'd do this? Yes. It'll cost you. You said so yourself. Marsh controls enough of this valley that he controls enough, Henry said, to make my life uncomfortable. He doesn't control enough to actually threaten anything I can't afford to lose. He paused. I've been comfortable for 8 years. I've been comfortable, and I've watched him do this 6 times, and I've told myself it wasn't my business. I'm tired of being comfortable, Josephine. The way he said her name, not Mr. Sullivan formality, not the careful distance they'd been maintaining, landed somewhere it hadn't landed before. She looked at the map. She looked at the documented acquisitions, the pattern of pressure and surrender, the systematic dismantling of people who had just been trying to build something of their own. She thought about the Dietrichs loading their wagon. She thought about a judge in Missouri who owed debts to the wrong man. She thought about her father's farm. All right, she said, but I want to be clear about something. Go ahead. I am not asking you to fight this for me. I have the documentation. I have the legal standing. What I need, what I'm willing to accept, is someone willing to stand in that room and make it harder for Howell to pretend the evidence doesn't exist. She met his eyes. This is my fight. I'll carry it. I just need the room to carry it without having the floor pulled out from under me. Henry Sullivan looked at her for a long, quiet moment. I understand, he said. That's exactly what I'm offering. She nodded once. Then we have an agreement. She left the ranch and rode back in the dark, and the stars were very bright and very cold above Montana, and she held the reins in her raw, calloused, capable hands and let herself feel something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not hope exactly. Something sturdier than hope. The thing underneath hope that hope gets built on. The knowledge that you are not in fact alone. The hearing was set for December the 2nd. Josephine had 8 days. She spent 4 of them finishing the cabin's interior framing. She would not let Marsh's maneuvering steal a single hour of building time. Not 1 hour, and the other 4 she spent in a kind of quiet, methodical preparation that would have been unrecognizable as preparation to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. She wrote to Robert Fitch again this time, asking not just for confirmation, but for a certified copy of the filing to be sent directly to the Larkspur Creek Land Office, with a note that it should be entered into the local record. She wrote to the territorial court in Helena, a careful factual letter describing the circumstances of the hearing and the prior documented acquisitions, and requesting that the court take note of the situation in case an appeal became necessary. She also had a conversation with Tommy Briggs's father. Ed Briggs was, as Tommy had said, the best carpenter in the territory, and he was also a man who had sat in that Thursday night meeting and heard Marsh speak, and had come home with a bad feeling he hadn't quite been able to name. He was not a brave man in the public confrontation sense of the word, but he was a decent man, and decent men are sometimes capable of courage if you give them a clear enough reason and a clear enough path. She went to his shop on a Tuesday morning, and she showed him the land commissioner's letter, and she showed him the survey confirmation, and she explained simply and without drama what Marsh was doing and what it would mean for the next family in the valley, who bought land and tried to build something and found that Clarence Marsh had decided he wanted it. Ed Briggs sat with his hands on his workbench for a long time after she finished. I've got a wife and 2 boys. I know. I'm not asking you to do anything that puts them at risk. I'm asking if you'd be willing to say in that room that you've seen my work, that you know the quality of it, that a woman who builds to that standard doesn't make careless mistakes with her paperwork. He looked at her hands, the blisters, the calluses, the particular roughness that came from 6 weeks of real work. You did all that framing yourself. I did. I was quiet a moment longer. My boy Tommy thinks you're something. He came home and told his mother you were the bravest person he'd ever seen. Josephine felt something in her chest shift sideways. She hadn't expected that. Tommy's a good kid, she said, keeping her voice even. He is. Ed Briggs picked up a piece of scrap wood from his bench and turned it in his hands. I'll come, he said quietly. I'll tell them what I know. She walked out of his shop and back down the main street of Larkspur Creek, and the cold air hit her face, and she didn't let herself cry, which took more effort than she'd expected, because the thing about being told you've been seen, really seen by a 12-year-old boy through his father's mouth, is that it gets through the armor in a way that almost nothing else can. She walked back to the boarding house. She got out her writing paper. She had 3 more letters to write before December 2nd. And in 8 days, she was going to walk into a room full of men who had decided she was already beaten. She had been beaten before. She knew exactly what it felt like. This was not that. She had 3 more letters to write before December 2nd, and when she walked into that hearing room, she intended to make sure that every word she had ever put on paper would be standing in the room with her. The first letter went back to Robert Fitch in Helena with a specific request she needed him to appear in person, or to send a deputy with authority to speak on behalf of the commissioner's office. She explained the situation plainly, and without exaggeration. She told him that a local judge with documented financial relationships with the contesting party was scheduled to rule on a clean filing. She told him that she was not asking for intervention, she was asking for a witness. Fitch wrote back in 4 days. He would send his deputy, a man named Arthur Gale, who would arrive in Larkspur Creek on December 1st. She read the letter standing at the boarding house door in the cold, and felt the particular satisfaction of a plan that was working, not because luck had gone her way, but because she had built it right, bone by bone, joint by joint. The second letter she wrote went to a woman named Clara Voss in Billings. Clara was a journalist. She ran a small but well-read column in the Billings Gazette under the initials CV, because the Gazette's editor had agreed to print her work on the condition that readers couldn't immediately tell a woman had written it. Josephine had met Clara 2 years ago in Kansas City at a meeting of a women's property rights organization that both of them had attended for different reasons. Clara for the story Josephine, because she'd known even then that she was going to need to understand the law around women owning land before she acted on it. They had stayed in loose correspondence since. Clara was sharp and fearless, and she understood that the story of a woman fighting a corrupt land grab in Montana Territory was not just a local story. It was a story about what women with property rights could and couldn't count on. It was a story people would read. Josephine's letter to Clara was short. She described the situation. She gave dates and names and document references. She said, "I don't know if this is useful to you, but I thought you should know it's happening." Clara's reply arrived the day before Arthur Gale did. It said, "I'll be there." The third letter she wrote was the one that cost her the most, not in effort, but in what it required her to admit. It was to her sister. Ruth Parker was 4 years older than Josephine and lived in St. Louis, and had written to Josephine every 3 months since their father's death, with a letter that always contained the same essential message, beneath the pleasantries: "Come home, Joe. Come back to something sensible. Let someone take care of you." Josephine had answered every letter with warmth and deflection, because she loved her sister, and because she had no intention of doing what her sister wanted, and she had not yet worked out how to say that without starting a fight she didn't have the energy for. The letter she wrote now was different. She didn't explain everything, but she told Ruth where she was and what she was doing, and that there was going to be a hearing on December 2nd. She told her the truth, which was that she was not afraid, but she was aware that things could go wrong in ways she couldn't fully control, and she wanted someone who loved her to know where she was, in case they did. She sealed the envelope and sat with it for a moment before she gave it to the mail. Then she went back out to her land and worked for the rest of the day without stopping. December 1st arrived with ice on the creek and a sky the color of iron, and Arthur Gale stepped off the morning stage, looking younger than Josephine had expected, no more than 30, with a serious face and a leather bag that he held like it contained something important, which it did. He introduced himself at the land office and produced his credentials, and the clerk behind the desk looked at him with the wide, slightly alarmed expression of a man who had not anticipated that the territorial commissioner's office would actually show up. Josephine met Gale at the land office. She shook his hand. He had the brisk, efficient manner of someone who had done this kind of work before, in places that were more complicated than Larkspur Creek, and he looked at her with the particular attention of a man assessing a situation quickly. "You've kept clean records," he said, after she showed him the full file she'd assembled, every document, every letter, Every certification organized in order of date and relevance. I know what happens when you don't. He nodded once, and she understood he wasn't going to ask her to elaborate, and she was grateful for that. Henry arrived at the boarding house at 8 o'clock that evening. She was in the small sitting room Cora Beach maintained for boarders, reviewing her documents by lamplight. And when Cora showed him in, he sat down across the table without ceremony and looked at the papers spread between them. "Gale is here. I know. I spoke with him this afternoon." Henry put his hat on the table. "He's good. He knows land law and he doesn't intimidate easily." A pause. "Marsh knows he's here." She looked up. "How'd he find out?" "Small town." A flat, brief statement of fact. "Marsh went to Howell's house tonight. I don't know what was said, but Howell's clerk spent an hour at the telegraph office afterward." Her stomach tightened. "Who'd he wire?" "I don't know yet. Miguel is trying to find out." He looked at her steadily. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" "Yes." "Howell is going to try to delay," Henry said. "That's the first move. He'll find a procedural issue, some document he claims he hasn't received, some requirement he says hasn't been met. He'll try to push the hearing back 2-3 weeks until Gale has to leave, and Clara Voss has to leave, and the pressure drops. He's done it before." She had already thought about this. If he tries to delay, Gale will object on the commissioner's behalf. An objection from that office goes into the record and creates a paper trail that's difficult to ignore. She looked at her documents. "And Clara being here changes things. Howell has to know she's a journalist. Whatever he does tomorrow is going to be written about." "Does he know who she is?" "He will by morning." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've thought about all of this." "I've been thinking about it for 8 days." "And before that?" She met his eyes. "Since Missouri," she said. He held her gaze, and in the lamplight, his face had the particular quality of someone who is feeling something he hasn't named yet. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." "I know how to handle long days," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I know you do." He picked up his hat and stood. At the door he paused. "I'll be there at 8. You won't walk in alone." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Henry." He nodded at once and left, and Cora Beach, who had very obviously been listening from the hallway, was suddenly very busy, rearranging the lamp on the front desk, when Josephine walked past. The hearing was held in the church because it was the largest room in Larkspur Creek, and when Josephine arrived at 10 minutes before 9 on the morning of December 2nd, it was already full. She had not expected that. She had expected the principals Howell Marsh and his lawyer, Gale Henry herself. She had not expected 3 rows of townspeople filling the pews on both sides. She had not expected Ed Briggs near the front with his hat in his hands and his jaw set. She had not expected Walt Greer from the general store, or the wife of the minister, or 6 people she'd never spoken to whose names she didn't know. She had not expected Tommy Briggs sitting in the very back row with his gap-toothed, serious face and his hands folded in his lap, who met her eyes when she came through the door and gave her one short, decisive nod. She held herself steady. She walked down the center aisle to the front of the room. Henry was already there, standing to the left of the preceding table, and he looked at her once when she sat down, a look that said, "I see you, and you're ready." And then he looked forward at Judge Howell, who was arranging papers at the front table, with the careful, deliberate movements of a man who knew he was being watched. Clarence Marsh was across the aisle with his lawyer, a soft-faced man named Pryor, who wore a good coat and had the particular shine of someone who knew how to appear confident while doing things that didn't deserve confidence. Marsh himself looked neither nervous nor triumphant. He looked like a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. He looked at Josephine once. She looked back. Neither of them looked away first, and neither of them looked away second, because the moment simply ended, and both of them moved on to what was next. Howell called the room to order. He was a thick-necked man in his 50s, with small, careful eyes that moved around the room quickly, taking inventory, she thought, calculating weight and support and risk the way she had already been calculating it. He saw Gale. His eyes paused, moved on. He saw Clara Voss at the side of the room with a notepad. His eyes paused longer. A muscle in his jaw moved. Prior Marsh's lawyer rose immediately. "Your Honor, before we begin, I'd like to address the presence of outside parties who have no legal standing in these proceedings." "Mr. Gale has standing," Josephine said from her seat. "He represents the Territorial Land Commissioner's office, which issued the filing in question. He has every right to be present." Howell looked at her with small, sharp eyes. "You'll address the court when addressed, Miss Parker." She held his gaze calmly. "Of course, Your Honor. I apologize." A beat. "The objection is still without merit." A ripple of something ran through the people behind her. Not quite sound. More like a collective breath. Gale rose and produced his credentials, and presented them with the quiet confidence of a man who had presented credentials in rooms that were considerably less friendly than this one. Howell examined them. Prior objected again on technical grounds that were thin enough to see through. Howell overruled the objection, and the particular way he overruled it quickly, without elaboration, told Josephine something important. Howell was recalibrating. The room changed his math. The commissioner's deputy changed his math. And Clara Voss, sitting at the side of the room with her notepad, and her stillness was changing it most of all. Marsh's claim was presented first, which was Howell's own decision, and which he didn't explain. Prior laid it out in smooth, practiced language that the Marshland and Cattle Company had held an informal prior interest in the creek section of the Parker parcel, communicated verbally to the previous owner. That the filing by Miss Parker had proceeded without proper notification to interested parties, and that the creek section in particular had long been understood by local convention and practice to fall within the Marsh Company's operational boundary. It was, Josephine thought, an impressive structure built entirely on air. There was not a single document in evidence. Every claim rested on verbal agreements, local convention, and the assumption that Judge Howell would nod and agree. When it was her turn, she didn't stand up immediately. She let the silence sit for one breath. Two. Then she rose. She placed the Land Commissioner's certified filing on the proceeding table. She placed the survey confirmation beside it. She placed Fitch's letter confirming the absence of prior encumbrance beside that. She placed a copy of the deed, signed and witnessed, beside that. She arranged them in a neat row, and she stood back, and she said clearly without drama, "Your Honor, I purchased this land legally. I filed it legally. Every document in that row has been certified by the Territorial Land Commissioner's office. There is no prior claim on record because no prior claim exists. Mr. Marsh's attorneys have described a verbal agreement with the previous owner." She paused. "Verbal agreements do not appear in property law for a reason." Prior objected. Howell sustained it, and something in the room shifted, a tightening, a collective stiffening, because everyone in those pews had heard what she'd said, and everyone in those pews understood what Howell sustaining that objection meant. Henry's jaw was set. I was watching Howell with the measured, steady attention of a man who was prepared to say something and was deciding when. Ed Briggs was already half out of his seat. Gale rose. "Your Honor, may I speak to the evidentiary standard?" "You'll wait your turn, Mr. Gale." "The Commissioner's office has a procedural interest in—" "You'll wait," Howell said sharper. Gale sat. His face was completely controlled, which meant he was angry, and Josephine made a note of it and moved forward. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to enter additional documentation into the record. Specifically, I'd like to draw the court's attention to 6 prior land transactions in this valley involving the Marshland and Cattle Company, in which the pattern of acquisition mirrors precisely what is being attempted here." The room went absolutely still. Prior was on his feet before she finished the sentence. "Objection. Irrelevant. Prior transactions have no bearing. Prior transactions demonstrating a pattern of fraudulent claim-making," Josephine said over his objection, her voice steady and clear, "are directly relevant to the credibility of the claim being made today." "That is an outrageous characterization." "The Dietrich family," she said. November 1885. Water rights claim manufactured after 11 years of clean title. The Dietrichs left this valley in February 1886, with their barn having burned down the previous December. The Werner family. Summer 1885. The Clausen parcel. The tall, Miss Parker. Howell's voice cut through the room. You will stop. She stopped. She looked at him. The room was very quiet. Howell's face had changed. The small, careful eyes had gone hard and specific, and she understood with a cold, clear certainty that she had just stepped onto the most dangerous ground of the day. This was the moment. This was where it could go wrong. She held his gaze and did not look away. Then Henry Sullivan stood up. I didn't say anything immediately. He just stood, and the room turned to look at him and the particular weight of who he was in this valley. The name, the acres, the 12 years of careful, respectable distance from any controversy, filled the room the way weather fills a room. Howell stared at him. Mr. Sullivan, Howell said carefully, you are not party to these proceedings. I'm a property owner in this valley, Henry said, and I have standing as such to speak to the pattern Miss Parker has described because I have documentation of that pattern. He reached into his coat and produced the land registry map she'd studied at his desk, annotated, marked, organized. 6 acquisitions, 8 years, the same method each time. I have the records. Pryor said something. It may have been an objection. Nobody paid much attention to it. Clarence Marsh, who had not moved or spoken since the proceedings began, turned in his seat and looked at Henry Sullivan with an expression that Josephine had never seen on his face before. It was the expression of a man who had miscalculated. What happened next took 40 minutes and felt like it happened in 4. Gale presented the commissioner's documentation with precision and authority. He entered into the record the certification of the Parker filing and the written confirmation of clear title, and he did so in language that was so precisely legal and so thoroughly documented that Pryor's objections slid off it without purchase. Ed Briggs testified that he was a master carpenter and that he had examined the framing of Miss Parker's cabin and that it was built to a standard that reflected careful planning and skilled execution, the work of someone who knew what she was doing and had done it right. 2 other men. Josephine didn't know ranchers from the south part of the valley, men she hadn't spoken to, men she hadn't asked Rose, and stated that they had observed the Marsh Company's boundary practices for years and that the creek section of the Parker parcel had never in their knowledge been treated as marshland or marsh interest. Clara Voss wrote everything down. Through all of it, Howell sat behind the proceeding table with the face of a man doing complex arithmetic. She watched him add and subtract, watched him weigh what it would cost to rule for Marsh against what it would cost to rule for her. Watched him account for Gale and for Henry and for Clara Voss's notepad and for the 3 rows of townspeople who were watching him do his job for the first time in recent memory. Marsh's lawyer made his closing argument. It was smooth and practiced, and it sounded like nothing because it contained nothing. No documentation, no evidence, no law. Just assertion and implication and the expectation that a judge would fill in the gaps with his own corruption. Josephine made her closing argument in 6 sentences. She cited the document numbers. She cited the legal standard. She asked for a ruling consistent with the evidence. Then she sat down and put her hands flat on the table in front of her and waited. Howell called a recess. He was gone for 22 minutes. She counted. When he came back, his face was arranged into something careful and neutral, and he sat down and looked at his papers and then looked at the room, and the room leaned forward in a single breath. In the matter of the Marsh Land and Cattle Company challenge to the Parker filing, Howell said in the flat, deliberate cadence of a man reading from something he's already written to avoid having to feel whatever he's saying, the court finds insufficient legal basis for the challenge. The filing of Miss Josephine Parker is confirmed as clear and without encumbrance. The creek section of the Parker parcel remains uncontested property of the filing party. He set his papers down. Challenge is dismissed. The room did not erupt. It did something quieter and more permanent than erupting. It breathed. A long collective breath that sounded like the release of something that had been held too tight. Ed Briggs put his head down and looked at his hands. Somewhere in the back of the room, she heard a sound that she thought, though she couldn't be certain, might have been Tommy Briggs, age 12, exhaling very hard through his nose. She sat completely still. She did not cry. She would not cry here, not in front of Clarence Marsh, not in front of Howell, not in front of any of them. She sat with her hands flat on the table and breathed once carefully and let the ruling settle into her bones where it belonged. Marsh was already moving. He rose from his seat and walked toward the door with the controlled, deliberate pace of a man who intends to make it look like he's leaving rather than retreating. Pryor scrambled to follow with his papers and his good coat. At the door, Marsh stopped. He turned and looked back across the room, not at Henry, not at Gail, not at Clara Voss with her notepad. He looked at Josephine. She looked back at him. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He turned and walked out. The room dissolved slowly after that, the way rooms do after something significant, people moving and talking and touching each other's arms and shaking hands, the whole loose, warm texture of people who have witnessed something together and are still sorting out how to feel about it. Henry was at her side within a minute of the ruling. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood next to her while Gail came over and shook her hand and offered his congratulations and said something about the quality of her documentation, and she thanked him sincerely. And then Gail moved off to speak with someone else, and it was just Henry beside her and the room moving around them. "Well?" he said quietly. "Well?" He looked at her sideways. "How do you feel?" She considered the question honestly. "Like I'd like to go back to my land and drive some nails." He made a sound that was indisputably a laugh, brief and low but real. She had not heard him laugh before. It sounded like a man who didn't do it often enough. Ed Briggs reached her next. He extended his hand and she shook it, and he said, "My boy's going to be insufferable when I tell him." And she said, "He's earned it." And something in Ed Briggs's face settled into something she thought might be the beginning of being proud of himself. Clara Voss was last. She closed her notepad and came over and looked at Josephine with the sharp, warm, unsentimental eyes of a woman who had seen a great deal and was not easily impressed. "I'm going to write this," Clara said. "I know. The Billings Gazette, maybe larger if the Wire takes it." "I hope it does," Josephine said. "Not for me. For the next woman who buys land and finds Marsh on her doorstep. Or the next family. Let them know it can be fought." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to be someone people remember." Josephine shook her head. "I'm going to be someone who finished her cabin." "That's enough." She walked out of the church into the December air, and she stood on the step for a moment, with the cold hitting her face, and the wide, iron-colored Montana sky above her, and she let herself feel it, all of it. Everything she'd been managing and controlling and keeping behind glass for the last 8 days, for the last 2 months, for the last 3 years. She felt the loss of Missouri, and the weight of starting over, and the 6 weeks of blisters and aching shoulders and cold dawns. She felt the dead rabbit on the property line, and the pulled stakes, and Marsh's pleasant smile, and Howell's small, careful eyes. She felt Tommy Briggs handing her a mallet. She felt Henry Sullivan holding the crossbeam while she drove the pins. She felt all of it, for exactly as long as it took her to take 2 slow breaths. Then she put it back, not away. She didn't believe in away. She put it into the place where things lived that had made her who she was, the place where her father's voice lived, and her mother's hands, and the farm in Missouri, and everything she had learned from losing it. Henry came out of the church behind her. He stood beside her on the step. "Are you all right?" "Yes. I'm very all right." Howe was quiet for a moment. Then, "The hearing might have gone differently without you, without your preparation, without the letters you wrote, and the people you reached, and the documents you assembled." He paused. "I want you to know I understand that. This wasn't my victory. I just made it harder for them to steal yours." She turned and looked at him. The December light was thin and cold, and it caught the lines of his face honestly without flattery, and what she saw there was something she had been slowly learning to read over the last 2 months. It's a man who had chosen today to be the person he'd probably always wanted to be, and hadn't quite gotten around to being. "You did more than that. You know you did." He held her gaze. Maybe I did." She looked back at the street. Larkspur Creek was going about its afternoon, horses and wagons and voices and smoke from chimneys, and it looked exactly the same as it had looked every other day. And yet something in it was different in the way that something is different after a thing that can't be undone has been done. I'm going back to my land. I have a window frame to finish. Today. He looked at the sky. It's past noon. The light will go by. I know when the light goes. I've been watching it go for 6 weeks. He stood beside her for another moment. Then he said, I'll ride out with you. She looked at him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She looked at him a moment longer. All right. They walked toward their horses, and behind them, the town of Larkspur Creek murmured and moved, and somewhere in the back of a church pew, a 12-year-old boy was already composing in his head the story he was going to tell his mother. The whole story. Start to finish the way he had watched it, about the day the woman everyone said couldn't win, walked into a room and won. About the day. The woman everyone said couldn't win, walked into a room and won, and Tommy Briggs would tell that story for the rest of his life. But neither Josephine nor Henry knew that yet, as they rode out together toward her land in the thin December light, and the silence between them on that ride was the most comfortable silence either of them had inhabited in years. She noticed it first, the absence of the need to fill it. She had spent 3 years in silences that felt like holding her breath. Silences in courtrooms and boarding houses and empty farmhouses and long stage rides through country that didn't care about her, and this one was different. This one had company in it. Not just Henry riding beside her, but something in the quality of the air between them that had changed since the church, since he'd stood up in that room, since the ruling had come down and the room had breathed. She didn't say anything about it. She was not a woman who named things before they were ready to be named. They reached her property as the light was going gray and thin, and she tied the livery horse and picked up her tools, and Henry tied his horse beside hers and picked up the other end of the window frame without asking, and they worked together until the light made it impossible, which was not very long, and then they stood in the near dark and looked at what they'd done. The cabin had walls, all 4 of them. The roof framing was half complete. The windows were framed and waiting for glass she'd ordered from Billings 3 weeks ago that hadn't arrived yet. The door hung on its hinges. She'd hung it herself 2 days before the hearing, because she had refused to let Marsh take that from her too. It's going to be something, Henry said quietly. Not flattery. Observation. It already is, she said. He looked at her sideways in the last of the light. Yes, he said. It is. She picked up her tools and carried them inside to where she kept them overnight, and he walked back to his horse, and before he mounted he said, I'll come by tomorrow. You don't have to keep doing that, she said. I know, he said for the second time that day. I'll come by anyway. She watched him ride away into the dark, and then she went into the boarding house and ate whatever Cora Beach had left covered on the kitchen table, and she sat in the quiet of her room for a long time before she slept, and when she slept without dreaming, which was the first time in months. December moved. The glass arrived from Billings on the 8th, 6 panes packed in straw, all of them intact, which felt like a small miracle, and she spent 2 days fitting them, working with the particular focused care that glass required a different kind of attention than wood and nails, more patient, more precise. She had never glazed a window before. She had read about it carefully. She did it 3 times wrong and once right on the first pane, before she understood the material, and then she did the remaining 5 without error. Henry came by on the 9th while she was finishing the last pane. He stood at the window opening and watched her work, and didn't offer help, which was exactly right, because this was the kind of work that required both hands and all of your attention and no conversation. When she was done, he leaned forward and looked through the glass and said, You can see the creek from here. That's why I put it there, she said. He straightened and turned and leaned against the wall and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one he wore when he was about to say something he'd been holding for a while. The Gazette ran Clara's piece, he said. She set down her glazing tool. When, 3 days ago, Walt Greer got the copy this morning. It's thorough. How thorough? She named Marsh. She named Howell. She named the Dietrich family and the Werner parcel and the others. She cited the documents. She quoted the ruling. A pause. She quoted you. Josephine was very still. What did she quote? Your closing argument, the 6 sentences. He looked at her steadily. The part where you said verbal agreements don't appear in property law for a reason. She felt something move through her that wasn't pride exactly, but was in the same neighborhood. It was the feeling of having said a true thing and had it heard. Has Marsh responded? Not yet. Pryor was seen at the telegraph office this morning. Henry's voice was even. That's not nothing. No, she agreed. It's not. She picked up her tool again, then set it back down. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Marsh is deciding between 2 things. The first is cutting his losses, moving on, finding another target, letting the piece in the Gazette die in the news cycle the way things do. He crossed his arms. The second is deciding that you've embarrassed him enough that the cost of embarrassment is now higher than the cost of a fight. She understood the distinction. And if it's the second, then we haven't seen the end of Clarence Marsh, Henry said. And I think you know that. She did know it. She had known it since the moment she watched him walk out of that church with his controlled, deliberate step. That wasn't the walk of a man who was done. That was the walk of a man who was reorganizing. Then we'll handle it, she said. Henry looked at her for a moment. We, he said. She met his eyes. The word had come out without calculation, and she wasn't going to take it back because it was the right word, and she was done pretending otherwise. We, she said again steadily. Something shifted in his face. She couldn't have named exactly what it was, but it was the kind of shift that happens when a thing settles into place that has been working its way there for a while. All right, he said quietly. We. The letter from Clarence Marsh arrived on December 14th. Not to Josephine, to Henry. She found out about it because Henry rode out to her land that morning with a look on his face she hadn't seen before, a tightness around the jaw, a quality of controlled anger that was like looking at a still surface over fast water, and he produced the letter and handed it to her without preamble. She read it standing in the cold, with her breath making clouds. The letter was formal, legal in its language and precise in its threat. It alleged that Henry Sullivan had interfered in a legal proceeding, made false representations to the court, and presented fraudulent documentation regarding the prior land transactions, that the records he'd cited were incomplete and misrepresented. It alleged further that as a result of this interference, the Marsh Company had suffered material damage to its business interests and reputation, and that unless Henry Sullivan made a public retraction and provided a written apology within 10 days, the Marsh Company intended to pursue legal action. She read it twice. Then she handed it back. It's a bluff. Yes, Henry said. But it's a bluff with teeth. If he files suit, even a frivolous one, it ties up the documentation and the records for months. It makes the story about me about a dispute between 2 landowners instead of about his pattern of fraud. He looked at the letter. And it puts me in the position of either backing down publicly or spending a significant amount of time and money defending something that shouldn't need defending. She looked at him. He was holding the letter the way you hold something that has surprised you in a way you should have anticipated. Are you going to back down? He looked at her. What do you think? I think you didn't stand up in that church to sit down 10 days later, she said. But I also think this is going to cost you, and you knew it would, and I want to make sure you're choosing this with clear eyes. He folded the letter. My eyes are clear. They've been clear since December 2nd. She believed him. She believed him completely, which was not a thing she did easily with anyone, and the fact that she did it without effort now told her something she already suspected about how thoroughly Henry Sullivan had worked his way past the careful defenses she'd spent 3 years constructing. Then we need to talk about strategy, she said. Yes, we do. He tucked the letter back into his coat. Not here. Come to the ranch tonight. Bring everything. She brought everything. They spread the documents across his desk, her file, and his annotated map, and the Gazette piece, and the Marsh letter, and 3 years of land records that Henry had been quietly accumulating since long before he'd ever spoken to Josephine, since before he'd known exactly why he was accumulating them. He had known something was wrong. He had known it for years. He had filed the knowledge away in the organized, careful way that characterized everything he did. and it had sat there waiting for the moment he was ready to do something about it. She looked at the accumulated records. "You've been building this file for 3 years. 4. She looked up at him. "You knew. I suspected." He sat down across from her. "After the Dietrichs, I pulled their records. I looked at the acquisition. I looked at how Howell handled it, and I saw the shape of something." He paused. "I told myself I needed more before I could act. More evidence, more certainty. But that wasn't entirely honest." "What was it then?" I was quiet for a moment. "It was that doing something would cost something. And I had built a very comfortable life, and I wasn't sure the cost was mine to pay." He looked at the documents. "I've thought about that a lot over the last few weeks, about what I've been paying instead all this time for staying comfortable." She understood that. She had paid a different kind of price for a different kind of staying still once back in Missouri, before she'd learned that still was just another word for slowly losing. "What do you want to do?" He spread his hands on the desk. "I want to give this to a lawyer in Helena. Not a local man, someone outside Marsh's reach. I want a legal opinion on whether the prior acquisitions constitute a prosecutable pattern of fraud. If they do, I want to file a complaint with the Territorial Attorney's Office." He looked at her. "And I want to send a copy of everything to Clara Voss before Marsh's people can muddy the water." Josephine looked at the documents. She looked at the shape of what he was describing, not just defense, not just holding the line, but something that went further than anything she'd originally set out to do. She had come to Montana to build a cabin and live her life. She had not come to dismantle Clarence Marsh's 8-year enterprise. But the Dietrichs had left with a burned barn and a wagon, and the Werners, and 4 other families whose names were on that map. "If we do this," she said slowly, "it goes past me, past my 40 acres. Yes, it becomes something bigger. Yes. Are you ready for that?" He looked at her with a steadiness that she had come to understand was not the steadiness of a man who felt nothing but the steadiness of a man who felt things deeply and had learned through some difficulty she didn't yet know the full shape of to not let the feeling govern him before he was ready. "I'm ready," he said. "I've been waiting to be ready for 4 years. I think what I was actually waiting for was a reason that mattered enough." He held her gaze. "I found it." The fire crackled. Outside the ranch was quiet and cold and dark. Inside at this table, 2 people who had each spent too long being alone were sitting close enough that she could have reached across the documents and touched his hand. She didn't do it yet, but she thought about it. And the fact that she thought about it without immediately setting the thought aside told her everything she needed to know about where she was. "Write to Helena in the morning." "I'll write to Clara tonight." He nodded, then after a pause, "Stay for supper. Miguel made enough for 4 people, he always does." She looked at him. "Henry, it's supper, not a proposition. I know what it is. I'm trying to remember if I've eaten today." He almost smiled. "Have you?" She thought about it. "Cornbread this morning." "Stay for supper," he said again. "All right." Miguel fed them venison stew and cornbread and strong coffee, and he did it with the quiet, easy hospitality of a man who cooked for people he respected and understood that supper at a table was its own kind of conversation. He sat with them for part of it and talked about the weather coming in a real storm. He said bigger than anything they'd had yet this season, and about a fence line on the north pasture that needed attention before the snow hit. After Miguel cleared and went out to the barn to check the horses before the storm. Josephine and Henry stayed at the table with their coffee, and the quiet between them was the same quiet it had been on the ride from town, full, inhabited, comfortable in a way that neither of them remarked on, because remarking on it would have been like commenting on the sound of the fire. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes. You said you've had things taken from you, not land, but things that mattered." She looked at her coffee. "You don't have to answer." I was quiet for a moment. Then, "My wife. 7 years ago. She died in the second winter after we were married. Fever." He turned his cup in his hands. "We'd been married 14 months. We had plans. The kind of plans people make when they're young and convinced the world is arranged in their favor." He paused. "It wasn't a gradual thing losing her. It was very fast. And then it was done. And I had the ranch and the cattle and 12,000 acres, and I was 26 years old and entirely alone. She held still and listened, the way she'd learned to listen without filling the silence, without reaching for it, just letting it be what it was. I told myself I preferred it. The aloneness, that it was simpler, that I'd had my one good thing, and that was more than a lot of men got. He looked at the fire. I was very convincing. I convinced myself completely. A pause. Until about 6 weeks ago. She didn't ask him what had happened 6 weeks ago. She knew what had happened 6 weeks ago. A woman had been standing in the dirt with a hammer, and he had looked at her, and something inside him had shifted the way ground shifts after a long freeze finally breaks. I'm sorry about your wife. Truly. Thank you. Truly. They sat with that for a moment. My husband, she said then, and felt him go still beside her. I was married, before Missouri, for 2 years in Kansas. He was a kind man. She paused. He died of cholera in the summer of '82. He was 30 years old. Henry was very quiet. After that, I went back to Missouri, back to my father. And for a while I thought that was enough, being useful, being near family. And then my father died, and Gerald Holt appeared, and the farm went, and I was 32 years old, and I had no one and nothing. And I understood finally that no one was coming. That there was no arrangement the world had made on my behalf. She looked at her hands wrapped around the coffee cup. So I stopped waiting for one. I came here. I bought the land. I started building. You built something extraordinary, Henry said quietly. I built a cabin, she said, with help by the end. You built more than a cabin. You know you did. She looked at him. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she'd been learning. The careful feeling running under the still surface, and for the first time she let herself look back at it directly, without filing it under irrelevant or premature or complicated. It wasn't any of those things. It was simply true. Henry. I know, he said. He reached across the documents on the table and covered her hand with his, and she let him. And his hand was warm and steady, and the fire crackled, and outside the wind was picking up ahead of Miguel's predicted storm, and neither of them moved for a long time. The storm hit the valley on December 16th and lasted 3 days. She spent the first day at the boarding house, writing letters to Clara Voss, to the lawyer in Helena, whose name Henry had given her a follow-up to Robert Fitch. She spent it also unexpectedly reading a letter from her sister Ruth that arrived on the morning stage just ahead of the storm. The longest letter Ruth had ever written, her 7 pages in Ruth's small, neat hand, and she sat on her cot and read every word twice. Ruth was frightened for her. That was most of the 7 pages. But underneath the fear and the please come home and the you don't have to prove anything. Joe. The letter had a thread in it that Josephine hadn't felt in any of Ruth's previous letters, a thread of something approaching respect. Ruth had read Clara's piece in the Gazette, which had run in the St. Louis papers as a wire story. She had read her sister's name in print, and her sister's words quoted, and the description of what Josephine had done, and something in her had shifted. I'm proud of you, the letter said near the end. I don't understand you, and I never entirely have, but I am so proud of you. Josephine folded the letter carefully and put it with the others in her leather satchel, and she sat for a moment with the particular sweet weight of being known by someone who loved you. And then she picked up her pen and started writing back. The second day of the storm, Henry came to the boarding house. He came at mid-morning shaking snow from his coat, and Cora Beach let him in with the slightly flustered, slightly pleased air she had been wearing around Henry Sullivan since approximately December 2nd. He came into the sitting room, where Josephine had commandeered the table for her correspondence, and he sat down and pulled a document from his coat. The lawyer in Helena wrote back. Fast. She looked up. That's fast. I may have sent the letter by telegraph and offered to pay for a telegraphed reply. A very long reply. She almost smiled. And he spread the document on the table. He says the pattern is prosecutable. Not certain, these things are never certain, but he has seen similar cases succeed at the territorial court level. He says the key is the Dietrich barn. He pointed to a section of the document. If we can establish even circumstantially that the barn fire was connected to Marsh's pressure campaign, it moves from civil fraud to criminal conduct. Criminal conduct means the territorial attorney has to take it seriously, regardless of local judicial relationships. She leaned over the document. How do we establish the barn? The Dietrichs. They left. They went to Oregon, I think. If they're willing to make a statement. Can you find them? I've already sent a letter. He paused. Miguel's brother lives in Portland. He knows people. She looked at him. How long have you been working on this? Since the night you came to the ranch. Since we spread everything on the desk. She sat back. The storm was loud against the boarding house windows, and the fire in the sitting room was burning well, and Cora Beach was extremely busy in the hallway just beyond the door. The world outside was white and stopped, and in here they were building something, not just a case, but a thing that had the shape and weight and inevitability of something that was going to last. Marsh is going to know we're moving. When Helena responds formally when the Dietrichs are contacted, he's going to know. Yes, Henry said. And he's going to move first if he can. That's why I need you to tell me honestly whether there's anything about your situation here. Anything about the filing or the purchase or anything from Missouri that he could use. Any vulnerability. He looked at her directly. Not because I doubt you. Because I need to know the whole board. She held his gaze. It was the right question, and she respected him for asking it. Nothing. Everything I've done since Missouri has been clean. More than clean, I have been meticulous, Henry, because I knew I couldn't afford not to be. Gerald Holt taught me that whatever you think you can afford to overlook, you can't. So I haven't overlooked anything. She paused. Missouri was different. I was different. I trusted that the law would work the way it was supposed to work, and I was wrong. I won't make that mistake again. I know you won't. The filing is clean. The purchase is clean. The cabin is built to code. She almost laughed at herself. I've been building it to code, even though there's no one out here to enforce a code, because I knew I might need to prove that someday, and I didn't want there to be any question. He looked at her with that expression, the steady feeling Stillwater expression, and said, You are remarkable, you know. I'm careful. Those aren't mutually exclusive. The storm broke on the 18th, leaving a foot of clean snow on everything, and Josephine went back to her land the morning it broke and stood in front of her cabin in the white and silent world and looked at what she had made. It was objectively a small structure. One main room, a sleeping loft, a lean-to kitchen she'd added on the east side, a stone fireplace she'd built herself over the course of 4 brutal days in October, using a technique she'd learned from a book she'd borrowed from Walt Greer and hadn't yet returned. The windows were glazed. The door hung true. The roof she'd needed Henry's help with the final section of roof framing. She acknowledged that without discomfort, the roof was tight and pitched correctly to shed the Montana snow. She walked to the door and pushed it open and stood in the doorway. Inside her cabin smelled of fresh-cut wood and sawdust, and the particular cold, clean smell of a new space that hasn't been lived in yet. The fireplace was empty. The floor was bare. There was nothing in it yet that made it a home instead of a building. She stood in the doorway for a long time. She thought about her father's house in Missouri, the one she'd grown up in, the way it had smelled in winter. Wood smoke and bread, and the particular warmth of a house where the same people had lived for many years. She thought about the farm. She'd lost the house she'd walked out of for the last time with her trunk and her satchel, the way she'd made herself not look back. She thought about the fact that she hadn't looked back. She stepped inside. She walked to the center of the room and stood on the bare floor and turned slowly, taking in the 4 walls. The windows with their imperfect but functional glass, the fireplace, the loft above. The bones. The bones were right. Everything else could be fixed. She heard hoofbeats outside. She turned. Henry filled the doorway. He had to duck slightly for the frame she had built the door to her own height, and he had an inch on her, and he stood there looking at her standing in the middle of her empty cabin, with the winter light coming through the windows she'd glazed with her own hands. I wanted to see it. Properly, from inside. She gestured at the room. There it is. He stepped in. He walked around the perimeter slowly, the way someone walks through a place they're taking seriously, touching the wall joints, checking the fireplace, looking up at the loft framing. He was reading the quality of the... She understood the same way Ed Briggs had read it in that church. Not with the eye of a man evaluating a woman's achievement, but with the eye of someone who understood craft and was encountering it plainly. The chimney draw will be excellent, looking at the fireplace. I spent 3 days on the flue angle. I can see that. He looked at the loft. You'll be able to see the creek from up there. That's why I put the loft there. He turned and looked at her. Standing in the middle of her cabin, which was small and spare and entirely hers. She looked like herself, the most fully like herself. She'd ever looked to him, he thought, which was saying something because she had looked like herself every day he'd known her. Josephine. Something in how he said it, the weight of it, the intention made her very still. There's something I want to ask you, and I want to be honest about it. Not careful. Honest. She waited. I've been alone for 7 years. By choice, and then by habit, and then by a kind of comfort that I now understand wasn't comfort, but just the absence of pain, which isn't the same thing. He looked at her steadily. You've been alone too, and you built something here that you built for yourself with your own hands, and I would not for anything ask you to give up 1 inch of what you've built, or what it means. She was listening with everything she had, but I'd like to know. If there's room, not in the cabin, in what you're building, in the life you're building here. He paused. I'd like to know if there's room in that for me. The cabin was very quiet. Outside, the snow-covered world was also very quiet, the way the world gets after a storm, when everything is still settling. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had held the beam while she drove the pins, who had stood up in a room full of people who wanted her to fail, who had covered her hand with his at a table full of documents, and sat with her in the warmth of a fire she hadn't built, and let her tell him about a husband she'd loved and lost before he ever knew her name. Henry. I didn't build this cabin so I could be alone in it. His whole face changed. Not dramatically, not the way faces change in stories. Quietly. The way something thaws. No. No, she said. I built it so I could be home in it. She held his gaze. Those aren't the same thing either. He crossed the room in 3 steps, and she met him halfway, and he took her face in both his hands with the careful, deliberate tenderness of a man who understood that certain things couldn't be taken back and didn't want them to be. And the first snow of the Montana winter held perfectly still outside the windows, she'd glazed with her own hands. And inside the cabin, the bones were right, and everything else, all of it. Every beautiful and difficult thing still ahead of them was theirs to build. Everything else, all of it. Every beautiful and difficult thing still ahead of them was theirs to build, and neither of them was under any illusion that building it would be simple, because nothing worth having in Montana territory in the winter of 1887 was simple, and they were both people who had learned that lesson the hardest possible way. The first thing that wasn't simple arrived 4 days after the storm broke, in the form of a rider from Helena. He came on a gray horse in the late morning, a young man in a territorial marshal's coat who asked for Josephine Parker at the land office and was directed to her cabin. She was inside, hanging her first shelf, a simple pine board cut and sanded fitted against the east wall where she intended to keep her books, when she heard the horse and came to the door and found him sitting in his saddle with an envelope in his hand and a look that said he was relieved to have found her. Miss Parker, the rider said. I have a communication from the territorial attorney's office. She took the envelope. She opened it standing in her doorway. She read it once fast, and then once slow. And then she looked up at the rider and said, When did this come down? Signed 2 days ago, the rider said. I rode straight through. Thank you, she said. Get your horse some water. The creek's 20 yards east. She waited until he moved off, and then she read the letter a 3rd time very carefully to make sure she understood every word of what it said. The Territorial Attorney's Office had opened a formal investigation into the land acquisition practices of the Marshland and Cattle Company. The investigation had been triggered by a complaint filed jointly by 2 parties. The names were there in black ink side by side, Sullivan Henry R. and Parker Josephine A., and supported by documentary evidence submitted to the Attorney's Office through legal counsel in Helena. The letter further stated that Judge Howell had been asked to recuse himself from any proceedings connected to the Marsh Company, pending the outcome of the investigation, and that an interim judicial appointment would be made for the Valley District. The last paragraph said that the Dietrich family, currently residing in Portland, Oregon, had been contacted and had agreed to provide a sworn statement regarding the circumstances of their departure from Larkspur Creek in February of 1886. She folded the letter. She put it inside her coat against her chest, next to her heart without meaning to. And then she stood on the step of her cabin in the clean, cold December air and breathed. The investigation was real. The complaint had teeth. Howell was out. The Dietrichs were coming forward. She had not done this alone. She understood that, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would have been dishonest. And she was done with dishonesty in all its forms, including the kind people use to make themselves feel more self-sufficient than they are. She and Henry had built this case together, document by document, letter by letter, across a desk in his ranch house, with coffee going cold between them and the fire burning low. But the foundation of it, the clean filing, the meticulous records, the 8 weeks of refusing to be moved, that had been hers. That had been built before Henry Sullivan ever came down from the Ridge Road. The bones had been right. Everything else had followed from that. She rode to the Sullivan Ranch to tell him, and she found him in the yard with Miguel working on a fence section that the storm had damaged. And when she rode in and he saw her face, he put down the post he was holding and walked toward her with the immediate, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered. She handed him the letter without getting off her horse. He read it standing in the yard. She watched his face move through the words, the slight tightening, and then releasing the small controlled exhale that was Henry's version of what other men expressed with both arms in the air. They moved fast, he said. Your lawyer and Helena moved fast, she said. He looked up at her. Our lawyer. She almost smiled. Our lawyer, she agreed. Miguel had walked over, not obtrusively, just near enough that he could see something significant was happening without asking what. He had the quality Miguel did of a man who had been present for important moments in Henry Sullivan's life and had learned how to be near them without intruding on them. Henry handed the letter to Miguel. Miguel read it, and his face broke into the widest, most unguarded expression she'd seen on him yet, and he said something in Spanish that she didn't catch, and then he said in English, "The Dietrichs. They'll come back. To testify at least," Henry said. Miguel nodded slowly with the particular gravity of a man absorbing news that goes back further than the present moment. She understood there was history here. She didn't yet know that Miguel had watched the Dietrichs leave, perhaps had known them, perhaps had been one of the people who'd stood on a road in February 1886 and watched a family drive away from everything they'd built. Good, Miguel said quietly. That's good. The news about the territorial investigation reached Larkspur Creek before Josephine did, because in a small town, news always arrived before the people. It was about carried on the invisible current of telegraph and messenger, and the simple human inability to sit on information that felt important. By the time she rode back through town that afternoon, she could feel it. The quality of the looks. Not the sideways, slightly pitying, assessing looks of a woman who was building something foolish alone. Something else. Something more complicated and less comfortable for the people doing the looking. She had been a curiosity. Then a cautionary tale. Then after December 2nd, a surprise. Now she was something they didn't have an easy category for, because she had gone from being a woman who needed to be saved from herself to a woman who had, with a meticulous, quiet deliberateness, helped bring down the most powerful man in the valley. That didn't fit into anything Larkspur Creek had been trained to expect from a woman with sawdust in her hair and blisters on her hands. Walt Greer came out of the general store when she passed. He stood on the step and said, "Miss Parker." She stopped her horse. "Mr. Greer." He looked at her with the slightly complicated expression of a man who has been wrong about something and is deciding how to hold that. "I heard about the investigation," he said. "The attorney's office." "Yes," she said. A pause. He turned his hat in his hands. "I should have spoken up, at the hearing. I had things to say about how Marsh operated. I knew things." He looked at the hat. "I didn't say them because I was afraid of what it would cost me." She looked at him for a moment. She could have said something sharp. The month of riding past laughter was still sitting in her somewhere, and the subtle way the town had offered her doubt instead of help, and the whispered conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. She could have put that cost on Walt Greer's tab right now, and it would have been entirely fair. She didn't. Not because she'd forgiven it, she wasn't quite there yet, but because the man in front of her was telling the truth, and it had cost him something to say it, and she had always believed that truth deserved to be met with truth. "I know what it feels like to be afraid of what something costs," she said. "I was afraid too at the start. I just decided the alternative was worse." Walt Greer nodded. He seemed to want to say more and couldn't find it. She nudged her horse forward. "Miss Parker." His voice again behind her. She turned. "That's a fine cabin you've built," he said. "Finest piece of independent construction in this valley. Ed Briggs says so, and Ed doesn't say things like that lightly." She looked at him. "Thank you, Mr. Greer," she said, and she meant it. Clarence Marsh left Larkspur Creek on the 22nd of December. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain it. He closed up his main office in town, and his house manager was seen overseeing the loading of trunks and crates into a wagon, and by the afternoon of the 22nd, his buggy had headed east on the Ridge Road with his personal effects and two of his non-cowboy employees, and the particular speed of a man putting distance between himself and something that was gaining on him. Pryor, his lawyer, stayed behind long enough to file a withdrawal from the pending legal action against Henry. The retraction demand had never been answered, and with the territorial investigation open and documented pursuing it, would have been the kind of error that ends legal careers. Then Pryor left too. Josephine heard about Marsh's departure from Tommy Briggs, who appeared at her cabin door on the afternoon of the 22nd, with his gap-toothed face and his barely contained energy, and announced it the way boys announce things that feel like justice, with the whole body with volume. "He's gone," Tommy said. "Marsh. His house is dark, and the manager said there won't be any more deliveries, and Pete Alderman's father says the Marsh Company offices are closed up." "Tommy." She put a hand on his shoulder. "Take a breath." He took a breath. "He's gone," he said again, quieter, like he was testing whether it was real. "It seems so," she said. "Are you glad?" She thought about this honestly. "I'm relieved," she said. "Glad will come later, maybe when the investigation is finished and the people he hurt have gotten something back." She looked at him. "Marsh leaving doesn't fix what he did to the Dietrichs. It doesn't give the Verners back their water rights. It's a start. It's not a finish." Tommy absorbed this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "But you won," he said. "You and Mr. Sullivan. You won." She looked at him. This boy, who had handed her a mallet when she was a stranger, who had come to tell her about the hearing, when no one thought she deserved to know, who had sat in the back row of the church with his hands folded and nodded at her like she was someone he had always believed in. "Tommy," she said, "when you grow up and you're deciding whether to do the right thing when it costs something, remember this winter. Remember that you came and told me about the hearing. Remember that you handed me a mallet the first day you saw me and helped me haul timber when you didn't have to." She held his eyes. "You won too. You were part of this." He went very still. He was 12 years old, and she had just handed him something he would carry for the rest of his life, and some part of him knew it, and he didn't know what to do with it yet. So he did what 12-year-old boys do when they're feeling something too large. He looked at his feet. "Okay," he said gruffly. "Okay," she agreed. I went home. She stood in her doorway and watched him go, and felt quietly and without ceremony that the story she'd come to Montana to write was finally starting to look like what she'd hoped it would look like when she'd imagined it in the boarding house in Kansas City, sitting alone with a map and a plan, and nothing but her own conviction that she was capable of something more than what had already happened to her. The twist that Josephine had not allowed herself to anticipate came on the 28th of December, a week after Marsh left, and 3 days before the new year. It came in the form of a second letter from Helena, this one addressed to Henry, forwarded to her cabin because Henry was there when it arrived. He had been there most afternoons since December 18th, helping her bring in the furniture she'd ordered from Billings, 2 chairs and a table, and a proper iron cookstove that had taken both of them and Miguel to carry inside, without breaking either it or themselves. The letter was from their lawyer, James Whitfield, in Helena. Henry read it first, and she saw his face change in a way she didn't immediately understand. Not the bad change, not the tightening she'd learned to read as trouble, but something else. Something that looked like a man confronting a piece of information that was larger than he'd expected. He handed it to her without speaking. She read it. Whitfield had received a response from the Territorial Attorney's Office that went considerably further than the investigation they'd already been notified about. In reviewing the Marsh Company's documentation for the investigation, the attorney's staff had uncovered something Whitfield described as extraordinary, a pattern of forged survey adjustments going back 14 years. Not 8, involving not 6 parcels, but 19. 19 families. 19 pieces of land acquired through manufactured fabricated documents, cooperative local courts. And among the documents here, Whitfield's careful legal prose acquired a weight that she felt in her chest. Among the documents was a notation in handwriting, identified as Marsh's own, regarding a future target. A parcel with strong water rights and good timber access, and a single female owner who had recently filed and was therefore, in Marsh's estimation, vulnerable. Her name was on that document. Her parcel was described. The notation was dated October 3rd, 5 days after she'd arrived in Larkspur Creek. She had been targeted before she drove a single nail. She put the letter down. Her hands were entirely steady. Her mind was moving very fast through the implications, through the calculation of what this meant for the investigation for the 19 families, for the case that would now be built. And underneath all of that, beneath the quick practical intelligence that had kept her alive and building through 2 months of pressure, there was something smaller and more personal that she let herself feel for exactly one breath. She had been right. She had known what Marsh was from the moment he stepped out of his buggy and said she had made a start, and she had been right. And the knowledge that she'd read it correctly, that her instincts, her hard-won, expensive Missouri-forged instincts, had not failed her, that mattered. That was hers. She looked up at Henry. He was watching her with that expression, the careful, feeling one, and she said, 19 families. Yes, he said. 14 years. Yes. And he was going to do it to me before I'd been here a week. Yes. His jaw was set. But he didn't. No, she said. He didn't. Henry picked up the letter. He looked at it for a moment, then set it back on the table with the decisive finality of a man who has decided something. Whitfield says the case is strong. With 19 families and 14 years of documentation and the forged surveys as physical evidence, the territorial attorney has enough to pursue criminal charges, not just civil. Marsh won't come back to Larkspur Creek. He'll try to settle, she said. Yes, and Whitfield says we shouldn't let him, not without full restitution to every family he took from. She looked at the letter, at her own name in Marsh's handwriting on a document that was now evidence, at the date October 3rd, 5 days in. The Dietrichs, she said. Can they get the land back? The land was resold, but the investigation can pursue financial restitution. The attorney's office has the authority to seize Marsh Company assets in cases of documented criminal fraud. He paused. It won't be everything they lost, but it'll be something. She nodded slowly. Something. It wasn't enough, she knew that, and she wasn't going to pretend it was. 11 years of the Dietrichs' lives, the barn, they'd built, the land they'd worked. Money couldn't restore what that actually was. But something was better than the nothing that had stood in that space for 2 years, while Clarence Marsh rode around the valley on his buggy, being pleasant to people's faces. Write to Whitfield tonight, she said. Tell him no settlement without full restitution to all 19. Tell him we'll go to the territorial court, the federal land office, the newspapers, wherever it needs to go. Henry looked at her. That could take years. I know, she said. You're willing to do that. Carry this for years. She looked at him. She thought about the woman she'd been in Missouri, trusting the law to work, waiting for someone to see what was true, running out of time and money, and finally running out of hope. She thought about the moment she'd understood that no one was coming, that she was going to have to be the one who came. I came to Montana to build something, she said. Turns out the cabin was just the beginning. His whole face changed again. That quiet, complete way. It changed when she said something that got all the way through to him. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same way he had 10 days ago, and she turned her hand over and held his, and neither of them needed to say anything else. January came in, hard and clear. The way January does in Montana when the worst of the storm season has passed and the cold settles into a dry, brilliant, bearable thing. The cabin was properly inhabited, now furniture cook stove, a fire that Josephine had learned the particular art of maintaining through the night books on the pine shelf she'd built her leather satchel on a hook by the door. She moved in on January 3rd. She woke up the first morning in her own home. Her actual own home. The one she had built with her own hands on land she had bought and defended and would not surrender, and she lay in the loft in the gray pre-dawn cold and listened to the sound of her creek moving under its ice and the wind in the pines and the particular silence of 40 acres that belonged to no one but her. She let herself have that morning, all of it. She lay still and let every inch of it settle into the place where true things lived. Then she got up and built the fire and made coffee and started working. Ruth Parker arrived in Larkspur Creek on January 15th, stepping off the stage in a coat that was entirely wrong for Montana winter, with her St. Louis sensibility written all over her and her eyes wide and blinking in the cold. Josephine was waiting at the stage stop, and when Ruth stepped down and saw her sister standing in the snow, rougher than she remembered, leaner with something in her face that hadn't been there 3 years ago. Something settled and certain and new. Ruth Parker burst into tears on the spot. "Joe," she said. "Ruth." Josephine put her arms around her sister and held on. Ruth was warm and familiar and smelled like home in a way that reached back 20 years, and they stood there in the cold street of Larkspur Creek in the snow and held each other for a long time. "You look different," Ruth said when she could speak. "I am different," Josephine said. Ruth pulled back and looked at her. Really looked the way sisters look. "You look like yourself," Ruth said finally, which was both simpler and more complicated than what she'd started to say. "You look more like yourself than you ever have." Josephine held that. "Come see my cabin," she said. Ruth saw the cabin, and she walked through every inch of it, and she touched the walls, and the windowsills, and the fireplace stones, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she sat down in one of the chairs and looked at her sister and said, "You built this?" "Yes. Every bit of it. With some help toward the end." Ruth looked at her. "The man, Sullivan." "Henry," Josephine said. "Yes." Ruth was quiet for a moment, reading whatever was in Josephine's face. "Tell me about him," she said. So Josephine told her. Not all of it. Not yet, that would take days, and they had days Ruth was staying 2 weeks. But enough. The beam, the whistle, the church. The documents spread across his desk, his hands on hers. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was not natural to her, and which told Josephine everything about how seriously she was taking it. When Josephine finished, Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Is he good to you?" "Yes," Josephine said, simply. "Does he try to take over?" "He tries to help. There's a difference." "Does he know the difference?" Josephine thought about it. "He's learning," she said. "We're both learning." She paused. "He's a good learner." Ruth looked at her for another moment. Then she said quietly, "Papa would have liked this. All of it." She gestured at the cabin at the window at the world outside. "He would have been so proud." Josephine looked at the fireplace. At the stones she'd placed one by one. At the fire that she'd built and tended for 12 nights now. "I know," she said. "I think about that." Ruth reached over and took her hand. They sat by the fire in the cabin Josephine had built and didn't say anything for a while, and it was enough. Henry met Ruth on the second day, and the meeting was not without its tension, because Ruth was a woman who loved her sister fiercely and had watched her suffer and was not going to approve of anyone without sufficient reason. She watched Henry Sullivan the way she might have watched a fence for sturdiness, looking for where it gave. He gave her no easy openings. He was himself, steady, honest, not performing, not trying to charm. When Ruth asked him with St. Louis directness what his intentions were regarding her sister, he said without hesitation, "To build something with her if she'll have me. On her terms and on mine." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Josephine. Josephine looked back at her. "Well," Ruth said, "at least you're honest." "It's the most important thing I know how to be," Henry said. Ruth thought about this. "The second most important thing," she said, "better be showing up." "I've been showing up every day since October," Henry said. "I intend to continue." Ruth picked up her coffee. She looked into it for a moment. Then she said without looking up, "She's been alone too long. Don't make her sorry she stopped." Henry looked at Josephine. She looked back at him with the steady, open, unguarded look that she'd been practicing in the months since she'd learned it was safe. "I won't," he said. Ruth drank her coffee. "Good," she said. "Now somebody tell me where I can get a decent meal in this town, because I am very cold, and I ate nothing on that stage, but a biscuit that tasted like regret." The Dietrich's sworn statement reached the territorial attorney's office on January 22nd. It was 43 pages long, and it described in specific and damning detail the campaign of pressure and manufactured doubt and finally arson that had driven them from their land in the winter of 1886. They named Marsh's men. They named dates. They described a meeting with Marsh himself, in which he had, in terms that were artful but not deniable, made clear what would happen if they didn't sell. Whitfield wrote that the Attorney General considered the statement devastating. That Marsh, wherever he had gone, was going to have very few options available to him. That the 19 families, or their survivors or their heirs, would receive documentation of the investigation and would be represented in the proceedings. Josephine read the letter at her kitchen table. Outside, January was doing what January does, and the fire in her stone fireplace was doing what she'd built it to do. She thought about all the versions of this moment she'd imagined in the boarding house in Kansas City, in the stagecoach, in the first cold mornings on this land when she'd looked at the ground and understood that she was going to have to move every rock of it by hand. She'd imagined winning. She'd imagined having her land confirmed, and her name on the deed, and her cabin standing. She hadn't imagined this. The 19 families, the Dietrich's 43 pages, the Attorney General, the case that was going to go forward, not because of her alone, but because she had refused to stand still, and that refusal had made it possible for others to move. She put the letter down. She picked up her pen. She wrote to the Dietrichs directly, a short letter, plain and honest, telling them she was glad they'd spoken, and that she hoped the process would give them something back, and that she thought about their barn. She wrote to Clara Voss with the update, and suggested that the story had a new chapter, and that the chapter involved 19 families and deserved as large a readership as Clara could manage. She wrote to Robert Fitch in Helena, thanking him for the deputy he'd sent and for the certification that had made everything else possible. Then she put her pen down and looked at the pine shelf on the east wall, where her books sat in a row she'd arranged and rearranged twice already. The way you arrange things in a space you're still learning to live in. The sound of hoofbeats. She knew the rhythm. She'd known it since October. Henry came through her door without knocking, because she'd told him he didn't have to knock, and he had a look on his face that said he'd already heard Miguel had a way of knowing things, and he sat down across from her at her kitchen table, and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "It's done," he said finally. "It's not done," she said. "The case will take time. The families will take time. It'll be years before it's settled. You said so yourself." "The part that was about you," he said. "That part's done." She thought about that. About where she'd started, and where she was sitting right now at a table in a cabin she'd built on land she owned in a life that no one had handed her. "Yes," she said. "That part's done." He reached across the table, and she took his hand, and they sat in the warmth of the fire in January in Montana, and outside her land was covered in clean snow, and the creek ran under its ice to wherever creeks run when they're finally free to go, and neither of them needed to say anything more about where they were or what they'd become to each other, because the kind of thing they'd built together didn't need to be explained out loud. In the spring of 1888, when the snow came off the mountains and the creek ran clear and loud, and Josephine Parker's first real season on her land began, two things happened that people in Larkspur Creek talked about for a long time after. The first was the trial, or rather the settlement that preceded it, which Whitfield had warned them about, but which turned out to be larger than anyone had expected, because the territorial attorney was running for a seat in the legislature and had decided that being the man who brought down Clarence Marsh and secured restitution for 19 families was exactly the kind of story that won elections. Marsh settled. He paid. Not everything, but enough that the Dietrichs came back from Oregon, not to their original land, but to a new parcel in the same valley, and the Werner family rebuilt their fence line along the water access they'd surrendered. 11 families received what Whitfield called meaningful restitution. 8 more received something. None of them got back the years they'd lost. But they got something, and something, as Josephine had told Tommy Briggs, was not nothing. The second thing that happened in the spring of 1888 was that Henry Sullivan and Josephine Parker married in the Larkspur Creek Church on an April morning when the mud was thick and the sky was the particular blue that Montana produces in spring, like it's apologizing for January. The minister performed the ceremony. Cora Beach cried. Miguel stood with Henry and Ruth stood with Josephine, and Ed Briggs sat in the front pew with his wife and 2 sons, the younger of whom was Tommy, age 12 going on 40, who sat through the whole thing with his hands folded and his jaw set, and the absolute dignity of a person who understood that he was witnessing something important. Afterward, when the town was milling around outside in the spring mud, and the conversation was loose and warm, Tommy Briggs found Josephine standing apart from the crowd for a moment, and he walked over and stood beside her and didn't say anything. She looked at him. He was looking out at the valley, at the mountains, still wearing their snow, at the creek road that led to her 40 acres, at the wide, complicated, beautiful fact of Montana in April. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. Then after a pause, "I want to do something, when I grow up. Something that matters." He glanced at her sideways. "Like what you did." She looked at him for a long moment. This boy who had handed her a mallet and told her his pa was the best carpenter in the territory, and come to warn her about the hearing, and sat in the back of the church with his hands folded. This boy, who was going to be someone she had known it since the first day. "Then do it," she said. "Whatever it is, find the thing that's worth building and build it. Build it right bone by bone. Don't let anyone tell you the bones won't hold." She looked at the valley, at the mountains, at all of it. "They'll hold. If you build them right, they'll hold." Tommy Briggs stood beside her for another moment. Then he nodded one short, decisive nod, the same one he'd given her the morning of the hearing, and walked back to where his family was standing. She stood alone for a moment with her valley, and her mountains, and her 40 acres, and her life. And then Henry was beside her, his shoulder against hers, warm and steady, and entirely real. And she turned toward him, and he looked at her, and there was nothing complicated in his face at all. Just the clean, certain expression of a man who has come home and knows it. She had come to Montana because she wanted a place that belonged only to her. She had built one, and then she had built something bigger, something with a better foundation than she'd known, to plan for something that would still be standing long after the Montana winter forgot the sound of her hammer. Some people, when they are broken and starting over, build walls. Josephine Parker built a home, and every nail she drove into that Montana earth, she drove it with the knowledge that a woman who refuses to be moved, who knows the bones are right, and holds to that, when everything and everyone is pushing her to let go, can build something that will last 100 years and still be standing. When the story of how she built it is the only story anyone in that valley can remember. She was not the woman they had mocked. She was the woman they would never forget.